Hello, Rob Mather, founder of Against Malaria Foundation. I am honored to have you here as a guest of the Great.com Talks with podcast. And I'll just introduce you a little bit more because I'm fascinated by your organization. You are one of the very few organizations that I've been donating to probably every year for the last 5 years. And we'll dive into more of why that is. You're dealing with stopping or preventing malaria. And I'd like to start with malaria as a disease, because a challenge that I believe that you run into a lot is that people in the Western world, which is our listeners at most of them are from Europe and America, don't really relate to malaria as a thing, since it doesn't really exist in our part of the world. Can you please describe to me malaria? What is it like for a village in Uganda? How does malaria impact there?
Well, thank you, Eric, first of all, for inviting me on, and good to speak with you. Malaria can be a fundamentally devastating disease for a village. I mean, let's picture a village, 500 people. So we've got 250 bed spaces, if you like. Mum and dad, mum and baby, 2 small children, grandma on her own, various household mixtures as we can imagine. But we've got 250 sleeping spaces. Those 500 people, if they are living in a malarious area, go to bed at night and know that between typically 10 o'clock at night and 2 o'clock in the morning, a malaria-carrying mosquito could bite them. That means different things for different age groups. For the under 5s, it can be devastating because the under 5s have an immune system that is developing, and therefore is, by definition, it is not as developed as a teenager or a young man or a young woman. And therefore the impact of having malaria, the disease malaria, in your body, the parasite, malaria parasites in your body, can be such that it can, at minimum, make you severely ill. So think very, very turbocharged flu. People who are older will often say when they've had malaria, I wanted to die. So you can imagine it's pretty grim. So a small child under 5 has malaria, and it's fevers, it's sweats, it's I won't go into the biological details, if you like, of malaria, but it makes you very, very sick. And unfortunately, it can be fatal because the body just can't fight off what this malaria parasite does and its replication, and death can be the outcome. In a child who is older than 5, it can still lead to death. Typically, it leads to a very severe sick and illness episode, and the child or the teenager or the young adult will recover. The other people who are similarly at risk, 2 categories of people, are pregnant women, because when women are pregnant, their immune system is somewhat compromised. In a simple way, we could perhaps imagine it as compromised because you don't want to reject the baby. And it makes the mother more vulnerable. And that's why the 2 most vulnerable groups to malaria, particularly emotive, I suppose, is under 5s and pregnant women. Other people, the last category, in essence, I was introducing, are people who are ill in other ways. So people living with HIV/AIDS or with other illnesses, the comorbidity, as we would call it, morbidity, meaning illness, can mean that somebody is particularly vulnerable. So if you imagine this village with 500 people and there are malaria-carrying mosquitoes flying around, if you and I went to sleep in that village, if we transformed ourselves, we translocated ourselves there now, and the darkness is falling and we're about to go to sleep, and we know that these malaria-carrying mosquitoes are out there, we're going to be pretty nervous.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine it now. I mean, another way of thinking about it is, imagine before you close your bedroom door, somebody undoes a jar of 10 malaria-carrying mosquitoes in the very bedroom you're going to sleep in tonight, and then pulls the door shut I mean, it's horrifying. I mean, the thought is horrifying. I mean, you wouldn't sleep. I mean, you would initially try and get underneath the duvet and the sheets so that there was no gap, because you think, I don't want to have any exposure to this mosquito that's flying around. I mean, and we can all imagine this. I mean, it's not unimaginable in terms of, you know, how awful this is. So we're talking about people being very sick, deaths occurring, roughly 1 death for every 1,000 cases of malaria. But because the number of cases of malaria are in the, you know, in the hundreds of millions, you know, if not billions, I can't do the numbers in my head immediately. We're talking about very large numbers of people who die. So about 620, 650,000 people, something like that, I think, is the estimate of the WHO at the moment, die from malaria each year. And something like 400 million people fall sick each year. And we're talking about sub-Saharan Africa mostly. And your question really sort of asked me to sort of paint the picture, which I hope I'm sort of halfway through or partway through. The other image I had in my mind, Eric, when I started, as I look back, AMF, was that the death toll from malaria in the under fives each day, about 15 years ago, was the equivalent of 7 jumbo jets being full of 5 children. So now imagine a horrific picture, which is you and I go down to the end of our closest international airport's runway, and we watch 2 747s full of children under 5, crashing, going up in a fireball. And then we watch 3 and a bit times that happening. And then I say, same time tomorrow, same time the next day, same time the next day. So those of us who live in the developed world, who don't have malaria on our doorsteps, it is difficult to imagine, but perhaps those descriptions give you some idea of the problem that is sort of wrought daily with malaria existing in our on our planet as it does.
Yeah, it's a brutal analogy thinking of it in terms of jumbo jets and how big of a news it is every time something happens to any kind of plane, and yet this is happening every day. So let's go back to this village of 500 people. If you're visiting one of these villages and you are talking to people, do all of them then know someone who have lost a child to malaria or someone who died from malaria?
Yes.
Yeah, just that is
simple answer.
So you could, because that's kind of how cancer is in the Western world. Like if you speak to anyone, they either have a close relative or at least they know someone who is suffering from cancer, and it becomes this big scary thing that everyone is somewhat constantly thinking of. Like my fiance, she's a bit hypochondriac in general, and whenever something happens, it's pretty often that she's like, oh, maybe it's cancer. And I'm like, it's probably not, but it could be. And just having malaria then being present like that and knowing that it's the most devastating for children and pregnant people is, yeah, it's really scary. And I like how you paint the picture as well, like going to bed and just knowing, like, if I have 10 mosquitoes in my room and they will just bite me and I will scratch a little bit, that freaks the shit out of me. I'm not going to be able to sleep in there. And just knowing that these could actually kill me as well, that's even more horrifying. Yeah, okay, so what you guys are doing is you're raising money and you're using that money to give away mosquito nets towards these families. Tell me about why that is the way that you are dealing with malaria. Why is mosquito nets the way that you've chosen?
So the most effective thing we can do to prevent malaria is have people sleep under what we refer to as a long-lasting insecticidal net, an LLIN. And that is a simple net, which we can all imagine, a rectangular structure, 4 sides and a roof, that hangs down from 4 points or 1 point, depending on the type of net, on the ceiling, if you like, and is tucked underneath the mattress. And that keeps the mosquitoes out at night, because as we've just discussed, between 10 o'clock at night and 2 o'clock in the morning is the most at-risk time. That's when the pregnant female malaria-carrying mosquito needs a blood meal to reproduce. And so it is the pregnant female mosquito that we're worried about. And if we cover people with LLINs, then we can absolutely thump malaria, because effectively what we've done is we've put a dual action barrier in the way of this mosquito that we want to keep away from the person. Dual action because it's a mechanical barrier. The mosquito cannot get through the net. It's also a chemical barrier because this is not just a net made of fabric. It's either covered with or impregnated with insecticide, as long-lasting insecticidal net indicates. The long-lasting, by the way, refers to the fact the insecticide is long-lasting and lasts for 3 or more years. So when these nets are deployed, we're talking about households, we're talking about very different living structures, and they can, over time, be ripped and have holes and tears in them. And if you imagine we had a net without any insecticide on it, then a mosquito could land on the net, migrate to the hole, in other words, walk across the net, which is what it does, pass through and bite the person inside. If you have insecticide on the net, then these nets are 99.9% effective, even if they have holes and rips and tears, because in moving across the net, the mosquito picks up insecticide through its feet, and that causes something called knockdown, literally knocks the mosquito down and incapacitates it, or leads to killing the mosquito. And so they're incredibly effective at stopping the transmission of malaria. And therefore, that's what we do. There's no vaccine at the moment. We're all very familiar with the importance of vaccines, given what we have gone through and we are still going through with COVID. COVID, of course, is a virus. Malaria is a parasite. In fact, there are about 5 versions of malaria, 5 different parasites. And there has never been, until relatively recently, any sort of vaccine that deals with a parasite. So in recent times, some scientists have done fantastic work in coming up with a malaria vaccine, but it is not the malaria vaccine that we need, because its efficacy is only 35%. And there are various limitations to it, should I say. So it's a tool in the toolbox, but it's not a bullet, let alone a silver bullet, if I can use that analogy. And we don't have a gene drive technology solution, which maybe we could talk about later, but these are possible significant solutions for us in the future that could be more effective than distributing millions of nets that cost these days $2 each to cover every sleeping space in a country, so that we drive down malaria or drive out malaria. So nets is what we focus on, because they are the most effective way of protecting populations at risk.
Okay, so you're distributing mosquito nets, which is also killing the mosquitoes just by them landing on it or walking around on it. So it's a dual action way of dealing with this, much better than just my old mosquito net from IKEA. And it's a very cost efficient way then, since it's only $2 each. And you distribute this, as if we take a village here with 500 people, you would give each and every household a mosquito net.
Exactly. We cover every sleeping space is the aim. So $2 per net, roughly $2 in non-net costs. So the registration of every single household in an area that you're covering. In other words, people go household to household to establish how many people are in the household, what the sleeping space structures or arrangement is, so that if a household needs 3 nets, it gets 3 nets, because we want everybody covered, because that's the most efficient and effective way to do things. And then we, of course, need to distribute the nets, either done at a central point where pre-registered households, so every household pre-registered, we know exactly how many nets need to be given to each household and household head, and they are given 2 nets or 3 nets or 4 nets, however many they need. You don't give out the same number of nets per household, because that would simply be ineffective and inefficient, or inefficient, because you'd give too many nets to one household and too few to another household. So roughly $2 a net, $2 in non-net costs, so $4 per net delivered. And therefore, if we're looking at that 500 people in a village, 250 nets, we're looking at effectively $1,000. So it costs $1,000 to protect 500 people, and they will be protected for 3 years, because the nets last for 3 years and then they need to be replaced. And so a mass distribution campaign occurs again in a country, and millions of nets are handed out free to recipients, because that's the way you achieve very, very high levels of sleeping space coverage. And what we do over time is we bring malaria down. So that's and if we were to add some numbers in here, we would say there are some independent charity evaluators that have spent a very, very many thousands of hours looking at the research and the data and the work we do. And what it all boils down to is every $4,000 that we receive as an organization means that one person doesn't die, 1,000 cases of malaria are averted, and we can multiply that $4,000 by about 12, give or take, and that's the improvement in GDP of the area we're protecting. Because of course, if people are sick with malaria, the vast majority are sick rather than the vast majority die. If people are sick with malaria, they can't teach, they can't drive, they can't farm, they can't function. And so they're not being productive members of society, to put it on that economic level. So we have 3 significant impacts, 3 significant benefits of handing out the humble bed net.
You opened a lot of loops for me, my good friend. It's all very interesting. Let's start with what happens when this village of 500 people gets these 250 nets that they sleep under. How much is malaria being decreased in a village like this? Because I'm assuming some people still get bit outside of bed, and what happens then?
Let me just address the last point you made. People are bitten at times outside of 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., but it's a bit like a bell curve. The vast majority of biting cases are within that time. It does depend on the geographic location. It depends on the type of mosquito. There are sort of morning biters and nighttime biters, and so it's not a sort of 100% picture. But what we find when we blanket cover, if you like, all sleeping spaces in the village, is that you find malaria decreases dramatically. Now, we need to look at the micro and the macro. So the micro is the village. If we go into a village and we cover an otherwise or a previously uncovered village with nets, then malaria comes down quite significantly, alongside a number of other things that tend to occur. You tend to find that areas of stagnant water are reduced and removed. Even the positioning of an old tire in a village can be such that if you've ever tried to get every drop of water out of an old car tire, it's impossible unless you evaporate the last bit or you dry it out with a towel. My point being, there are many locations where water can reside, become stagnant, and that's where malaria-carrying mosquitoes breed. So often at the same time, what you're doing is removing areas of stagnant water. Potentially what you're doing is improving sanitation, which can contribute to the density, if you like, of mosquitoes in a particular area. So what you find is that malaria rates come down. I remember perhaps one of the most moving messages I had. You mentioned Uganda earlier, and in fact, the man I spoke to that I'm about to mention was in Uganda, a man called Mohammed, and he was a village leader. And I spoke to him when he was in a Red Cross office prior to us distributing about 50,000 nets in the West Nile region of Uganda some 12 years ago. And I happened to speak to him for a minute or two because he happened to be in the office where I was speaking to the Red Cross, who were our distribution partner for that particular distribution. And I spoke to him and mentioned what we were doing, and we had a conversation for a few minutes. And that potentially was going to be the last time I spoke to this very nice man called Mohammed. 6 months later, 4 months after we had distributed nets, we distributed nets 2 months after the telephone call, he came back to, and he told me on the telephone call, by the way, and we had the data, he'd had 357 cases of malaria in his village in the previous month. The village was about 1,000 people in size, a little bit bigger. So you had 35% of the people.
35% in a month?
35% of people had malaria in a 1 month period.
Whoa.
357 cases of malaria. And we had the health records from the region because we had lots of data that surrounded, was part of our planning. Anyway, he walked 6 kilometers back to the Red Cross village, and he walked in and he said, "I'd like to send a message to Mr. Rob." And the message simply read, "Mr. Rob, malaria doesn't exist in my village anymore." And that was because effectively they'd wiped out the malaria-carrying mosquito population. And so what is possible here is that if we imagine, a pebble in a pond, you drop the pebble in the pond and the ripples radiate outwards. If we go in and at the center of that, to take the analogy forward, if you imagine we go into a village and we remove malaria, because a mosquito has a 2 kilometer fly zone, that generally is, how far it travels. You can imagine then pushing out into more villages and pushing that concentric circle out, and you effectively remove malaria, and it's gone. Sri Lanka in 2017, an island, was declared malaria-free because in 2014, 15, and 16, they had no native cases of malaria. And 3 years of no native cases of malaria can lead the WHO to then declare that particular country or region malaria-free. And so it is possible to eradicate malaria. We don't need to wait for a vaccine. We don't need to wait for a gene drive solution to appear in the years to come. So at the micro and then the bigger micro, if I can phrase it that way, we can remove malaria. So one might ask, if these long-lasting insecticidal nets have been around for, effectively 15 years or so, maybe 20 years, why haven't we gone in blanketed with nets, and why have we got no malaria? Well, of course, like most things, it's not quite as simple as that. And when you hover up to the macro, we have all sorts of factors that lead to malaria persisting. I think it's the case that over half of the people that have ever lived have been killed by malaria.
Yeah, I've heard that as well.
Incredibly efficient at what it does, this malaria parasite. And of course, it doesn't want to kill, the malaria parasite doesn't want to kill anybody, because then, all of the people with malaria in their bloodstream that are non-malaria carrying mosquito then bites, picks up the malaria parasite, transfers it to the next host. So if you've killed the host, killed the person, that person is, to be grim about it, is going to be buried and is not going to be accessible to the mosquito. So that 1,000 to 1 ratio I mentioned is very effective for the transmission and persistence of malaria. So it's a canny thing that we're dealing with here. It's very, very difficult. And you have circumstances where nets don't get to regions, nets run out more quickly, they get damaged, people don't sleep under the nets. There are a myriad of things that go on, including if people contract malaria, if they get to a health center, the vast majority of people, if they're given a 3-day course of anti-malarial drugs, known as ACTs, which stands for artemisinin combination therapy. The artemisinin is the sort of drug of choice here. Taking a 3-day course of ACT can flush the malaria parasite out of your body so that you feel fine again. Of course, we're talking about health structures and infrastructures and commodities that are not necessarily in place or as sophisticated or as well looked after as we would like. In terms of, you've got 20 people working in a health center who are working unbelievably hard to take care of the 10,000 people or 5,000 people in their catchment area, they've run out of ACTs. So if people turn up to the health center with malaria, there are no drugs anymore. And therefore you have to literally sweat it out. Somebody has to go home and be sick for the next 2 weeks and leave, their own body to deal with malaria, which in most cases will happen, pretty grim to go through that period. And so we're dealing with an imperfect situation. But over the last 15 years, we've seen malaria come down until about 3 or 4 years ago. We've had a period of stagnation of malaria in a number of countries, not everywhere. But if we go back about 17 or 18 years, over that 15-year period up until about 2 or 3 years ago, we saw malaria deaths drop by 60%. So that's a really significant drop. And 2/3 of those deaths have been attributed to the distribution of bed nets.
Wow. And so, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the mosquito needs to bite a human for malaria to be able to spread, right? Or can they bite an animal and that would happen too?
It can bite a malaria-carrying mosquito, can bite an animal, but it's more difficult because the hide of an animal makes it more challenging to get through to get that blood meal. We are the meal of choice, and
so we are the meal of choice.
We're a target. So, but animals can be bitten by mosquitoes, and there are some particular species that prefer animals. As I understand it, there are, by the way, 3,000 species of mosquito.
Yeah,
we're interested in 40 of them. We're not interested in the other 2,960 because they're not vectors for malaria, transmitters of malaria. Yeah. 40 are, and of those 40, about 5 to 6 do the vast majority of the damage. So really, we're talking about 5 to 6 species out of 3,000 malaria mosquito species that are really the damaging ones.
Okay, and once we distribute these nets, then 2 things happen. Partly, a lot of mosquitoes land on these nets and die, and it happens to the pregnant females who will then not reproduce, which is obviously limiting the next generation of mosquitoes. But what also happens is that we make it harder for even the females who never land on these nets are less likely to find a human and will therefore also be less likely to reproduce. So we are handling that from 2 different directions, meaning that over time, the mosquito population will decrease simply because it will be harder for them to reproduce, as well as we are protecting people from suffering in the first place.
Absolutely right. And I think sort of embedded in the sense in what you just described is if you're reducing the infected blood pool, if I can way.
And so by infected blood pool, you mean people carrying the mosquito, the malaria
parasite. Yeah. So when a non-infected mosquito that doesn't have the malaria parasite in its body bites the person that doesn't have malaria in its body, that will lead to an annoying itch, but no transfer of the malaria parasite to the person and no picking up of malaria parasites by the mosquito, such that when it then goes off to bite somebody else, it transfers malaria. So keeping the infected blood pool down by keeping people protected under bed nets at night, by making sure they get to ACTs to clear out malaria from their body, so they're now no longer infected, is all part of the process that you are drawing together.
That's an interesting thing that I haven't thought about, that the faster someone gets to actually get medicated, the less likely that person is to spread malaria. I've never thought of it that way, but that makes a lot of sense. I've just thought it's about helping that singular person dealing with that singular case of malaria. But then, of course, that's also something that greatly prevents the risk of spreading from that person. It's interesting. I really like the part about GDP, as you touched upon as well, because I think like when I'm thinking about malaria, it's so easy to look at the numbers like, okay, 1,000 cases, 1 person die, $4,000 would save a life, as you mentioned. But just thinking of all of those 999 other cases with the less suffering, but also, like, as you say, like the GDP growth, the father who is able to work, the mother who is able to work, the parents who are not grieving from someone, a child or a friend who died or whatever. All of these things around it is so powerful, and yet so difficult, even for me, who is thinking a lot about this, to relate to. How do you communicate about this with people so they understand how huge this is?
Very simply, I think is the answer to that question, because we like within AMF to be quite simple in what we do. I suppose we share with people those three impacts that I mentioned earlier. This much money equals one person not dying. And we know that, by the way, because there is a huge body of research, including randomized controlled trials, which has to be sort of kept updated as we make progress against malaria, but tells us roughly how many thousands of dollars. And frankly, Eric, whether it's $3,000 or $4,000 or $5 or $6, I'm in the UK, and the National Health Service here will spend £30,000 on me to extend my life by 1 year. So we're talking low thousands of dollars, and I don't really focus on the number, whether it's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's a very low number. As long as we do other things in our operations and our work at AMF and the partners we work with in distributing nets, because we as an organization do not work alone. We're part of a wider team, if you like. So we communicate that that's the impact of this much money in terms of a life saved, in terms of malaria cases averted. And this is the number in terms of GDP improvements if we deploy $4,000 worth of effort in what we're doing. And a number of economists over the years, in fact, there are a number of papers that go back about 20 years that indicate that we're looking at roughly a sort of 12 to 1 multiplier. They look at the percentage impact, and I think it's a 0.5 or 1 or 1.5% impact on GDP in a number of countries they looked at. And again, we're talking about 12 times as directional. It might be 8, it might be 15, it will depend upon the country. But what we're talking about, which I think you were articulating very well, is that if you're sick, you make a good point. If you're going to a funeral, you're not working productively. And if we put our sort of economist hat on, and of course malaria is a very emotive issue. It's a very emotional issue when people are sick. If you've ever been to a hospital and seeing small children with malaria with drips in their arm, there's no lack of emotion there, even though what we do at AMF is we focus ruthlessly on data. And that's because I am, if not I'm one of the world's greatest cynics when it comes to charity, I'm afraid. And if I thought I was cynical when I set up AMF, 17 years on, boy, am I cynical now, given what I've seen, which is why we operate in a particular way. But we can imagine if you've got, many tens, hundreds, thousands of people that are ill, you can't function. And so it's trying to just paint that picture. We try and paint that picture to people, share the information very simply. And we find that's been, that simplicity of message has been pretty effective over the years in inviting people to think about what we can actually do against malaria.
I like what you're saying there, that you're one of the most cynical people when it comes to charity. Like I used to be very cynical about charity as a whole concept, and then I find glimmers of hopes in organizations like yours and many others. So I first found you probably 5 years ago through GiveWell. And for you listening, GiveWell is one of these independent organizations that Rob mentioned that evaluates charity organizations based on how effective they are. Like, how much good does this organization do with each dollar donated, and how transparent they are, and some other things that they're evaluating. And Against Malaria Foundation has been a top recommendation from GiveWell for 13 years, I think. Rob, many years.
14.
A long time. Yeah, 14, a long time, which is really huge because GiveWell is only recommending 10 organizations out of all organizations in the world. They basically slim it down to like donate money to one of these 10 organizations. And Against Malaria Foundation has been recommended over and over and over. And that gives me this glimmer of hope in terms of charity. And I want to help kind of get that word out there. Whenever I'm talking to people, I'm talking about these kinds of organizations. And I'm curious, we've already touched upon quite a few of the numbers. Like we've touched upon $4,000 per life, which could be 3, could be 8. We've talked about GDP, and we've talked about 35% decrease in one particular village, which probably is 50% somewhere and 5% somewhere else, which are huge numbers, both of them. Like how do you collaborate with an organization like GiveWell regularly? Like how do they evaluate you? What numbers do they give you? What does that kind of process look like?
The simple answer would be that we effectively give them everything they ask for. And I guess that probably indicates that what they ask for generally is, intelligent and sensible. But they just want to know what we do, the numbers, the data. They want evidence. They don't want stories. So we provide them with data. That's typically what we do. Obviously, there are conversations we have with them that are not so much data focused, that might be structured around the process we're going through in a particular country, how we're establishing the veracity of certain information when we're working in areas or at a point in our process where there isn't definitive information. We worked in one country some years ago where a pretty important starting point when we're working out how many nets we fund is what the population of the country is. And there were 3 official populations when you looked at the statistics and the official data in the country: 11 million people, 13 million people, 16 million people. That's interesting because, that's almost a 50% range in there. And of course, we don't want to overfund nets for a particular country, because it means those nets are not going to go to another country and protect, the number of nets times 2 in terms of people. So they're often wanting to know how we're going about approaching understanding really accurately, or as accurate as we can, and certainly above a threshold of what's going on. And that's at the heart, in a sense, of what we do. So our process for liaising with GiveWell is to have relatively regular calls with them. So they might be monthly. Information requests are sent across to us in between. And they really understand. I mean, they've spent thousands and thousands of hours, as they, I think, say on their website, understanding AMF as an organization alone. So they really, they are now expert in what we do. And in fact, we've improved what we do by being questioned and quizzed by GiveWell, because they are a very bright group of people, and they're seeking to understand. They're not seeking to deploy bias. And they come up with good ideas. In the past, we've said, that's a really good idea. We're going to do that. We're going to change what we do because that's a better way of doing it. So we don't claim within our organization that we have all the answers. I think that would be a silly place to be. So what they're after is data, and they're after understanding. And we're very, very happy to provide them with that. Obviously, some information is confidential to them. There's almost nothing I don't think there's anything we've not shared with them that they've asked for. We've certainly attached confidentiality clauses to it on prices we pay for nets for obvious reasons, because there's we get involved in, negotiations with net suppliers and so on. And I love that. I love the fact, and they're not the only organization, that they're certainly, the organization that spends most time understanding what AMF does, but there are other organizations that spend a lot of time speaking with us and doing research behind the scenes to satisfy themselves that AMF does what it says it does and what the results are of particular distributions we fund. And when they first approached me many years ago, I really liked the fact that they looked at that stage in their very early days, the 135 charities, and they made 2 recommendations. And the 2 recommendations were: support these 3 organizations. The second recommendation was do not support these 132. I thought that sounds right to me. That sounds as though they've really looked at challenging organizations to say, demonstrate to us you do what you say you do. And that, of course, moves us away from glossy publications and storytelling, and it moves us towards data. And that's where we focus our efforts.
So how did you end up in starting AMF? What was your background before this? Since it's clear that you focused on the numbers, I'm just curious, what was your personal story to get into this?
So my background in terms of sort of education and work was that I studied chemical engineering. So I was a sort of analytical, sort of scientist.
I was going to guess you were an engineer.
Well, I was really passionate about languages. So when I came out of university, and in fact, I was due to go to university to study French and Spanish, but that's a whole different story. But when I left university, I went to live in Italy for 4 years as a strategy consultant. And the man whose office I walked into, when I asked if I could go to Italy, said, "Terrific, you speak Italian." And I said, "No, but I'm very keen to learn." So I'm very keen on languages as well. I wish I could speak more, but I studied chemical engineering at university, went to Cambridge and really enjoyed that. Played an awful lot of football. That was my sport. Played an awful lot of sport, actually. And then went to live in Italy and work for a strategy consulting firm. So the first 4 years out of university for me were a sort of a grounding in strategy. And, I was a junior OIC, I was the lowest of the low. And I was absorbing and learning, and it was a really valuable 4 years to expose me to, various aspects of how, business works and you get things done. Then I went to business school in the States for 2 years. I went to Harvard and had 2 fantastic years there. Played a lot of football, played a lot of sport, and learned a lot. Met some terrific people and, grew up some more. It was my late 20s. Then came back to the UK and worked in an exhibitions business, a very small business of 6 people. I decided I wasn't going to go back to the strategy consulting firm that I still refer to as sort of family to this day, some 25 years on. A terrific company, but I wanted to, my personality was such that I guess there was an entrepreneurial bit in me, and I went and joined a small exhibitions business with a very talented individual who'd set up and ran that. Worked there for 5 years as effectively commercial director. So we built our own exhibitions, but in the sense that we started with a blank sheet of paper and worked out where in the market in a particular industry there was a need to bring buyers and sellers together in a trade show or an exhibition. And we developed our own assets, if you like, in that way. And that was a really interesting period. And I then, after 5 years, the next stage of my career was to go and work for one of the world's largest financial publishing companies, which I could talk about for a long time. I had a great time at this particular company for 5 years, worked with some terrific people, learned a lot. Things like go and earn the money before you spend it. Very entrepreneurial company, but a PLC, a very big PLC. So interesting blend of the corporate and the entrepreneurial. And eventually I set up a business within that business that I was the managing director of, to do with effectively rolling out the internet, because I'm referring now to 1997. So I'm going back 25 years or so, when the internet was at its earliest days. People didn't have websites and people didn't know what HTML stood for. I spent 5 years doing that. And so my work background, Eric, has been in strategy consulting, commercial director, operations director of a PLC, managing director of a particular entrepreneurial business within it. So a very wide range of experiences, being exposed to a wide range of people from whom I could learn and watch and listen to, to how they did things, and absorb. And then my movement, if you like, to setting up a charity, which was completely out of left field. And there's probably a 3-line version. I mean, I could talk about it for ages and lots of happy stories, but I saw a television program about a small child who suffered 90% burns in a house fire, decided to raise some money for her because I felt that was going to be helpful. 3 of us decided to swim a distance equivalent to the English Channel in a swimming pool because I'm not brave enough or fit enough to do the real thing. And what started as 3 people swimming became 10,000 people swimming in 75 countries in 150 swims. And we raised a very large amount of money and effectively more or less sorted out this little girl called Terry's sort of financial situation sort of permanently. And somebody said to me, what are we doing next year? And my throwaway line was, well, maybe we'll get 1 million people to do something, maybe 1 million people swimming to do something. And the Australian man, lovely man called Walter that I was speaking to said, terrific. That means we only need 999,998 more people. I'm in. And that little brain whirring around about, could we get 1 million people to swim? What would we do it for? And my thinking went, not developed world, not cancer, not heart disease, relatively well funded. I've traveled a lot in Africa and in Asia in my youth with a backpack, always went off for, weeks or months at a time. And so I've been exposed to, poverty and disease and illness, and I've seen it, and it certainly stayed with me. And so when I had an opportunity to think, how do I want to spend my time if I was to try and get 1 million people to swim? I went to think about HIV/AIDS, TB, malaria, landmines, freshwater, diarrhea. I think there might have been another one. And I had to research each of those areas, find out about them. And HIV/AIDS had a relatively large amount of money being put in its direction because it's a developed world disease again. TB, difficult. Landmines, political. Freshwater, massive. Diarrhea, complicated. Bed nets, malaria. 7 jumbo jets full of kids die every day. Biggest killer of pregnant women in the world, bar none, or very close to. Massive drag on the economy of Africa. In fact, if we want to help Africa out of the situation we find it in, fixing malaria is right at the top of the list. This is going back 17 years, 18 years. Most effective thing we can do, a bed net that costs $5, $2 now. Prices have come down. So I did a bit more research and found that there were a low number of millions of bed nets, long-lasting insecticidal nets being distributed in 2004. And the number of people who needed them was in the hundreds of millions. Aha, gap. And so, and so I organized a swim, and we had 250,000 people swimming back in 2005. And then, and I approached a whole bunch of organizations and said, a lot more politely than I'm about to put it to you now, but I said to many organizations, please, will you help me? But I'm not going to pay you because you don't need $5 more than a couple of kiddies in Africa need a bed net. And I'm delighted to say that all of the organizations I approached, Microsoft, PwC, Citibank, 17 legal firms around the world said, yep, we'll help. And in fact, from then and to this day, we haven't paid one single bill. We've kept things very simple in the way that we structure AMF. We're very focused in what we do in terms of the, central costs and activities and so on. And we've had fantastic help from people, individuals and corporations who I've approached in a strategic way. I choose who I approach and what I say. But many people, it doesn't matter how senior somebody is at the top of an organization, Microsoft or otherwise, PwC in particular were absolutely sensational. They know babies, they've got children, and when you say this and many people die, etc., and this is what I'm going to try and do, but I need some help. In fact, nobody ever said anything other than me when I asked them who will get to help me here. And so it's been a humbling experience over many years, asking people you don't know, will you help? Who do I talk to? And lots of people help us. So anyway, that's a brief run.
Beautiful story. Beautiful story. I like it very much so. Well, thank you, Rob, for taking the time to speak to me, and I really hope a lot of people will hear your message. What is something that people can do to help out?
Donate $2.
Donate $2.
Every $2 matters. Every $2 buys a net, protects 2 people. So if people are interested, they can go to againstmalaria.com and donate $2. And we allocate every single donation we receive to a specific distribution at the health zone level. And so you can see exactly how many nets you've brought. Clearly, some people might decide to donate multiples of $2, but $2 buys a net, protects 2 people. And we show people where their net is so they can follow it from manufacturer through shipping, in-country transport to distribution, so they can see what their $2 has done. It doesn't go into a sort of big black hole and we produce a glossy report. People see at the individual donation level exactly what's happened to their net.
That's and that's one of the important reasons why I've been donating frequently for many years and why I will continue to do so. Like I find it so inspiring to see, well, both to just be able to concretely say these $2 buys a net is so rare in terms of charity and rare elsewhere when you're trying to do anything good. And knowing that it has all of these ripple effects in society and around everything, and knowing that you're starting a spiral of less and less malaria because you're actually making it more and more difficult for these parasites to breed. There are so many beautiful reasons. So please, you listening, go and donate. It's the best investment I know you can do. Thank you for listening and have a lovely day.